What's going on, guys? TG or Thunder God here. Got a pretty interesting video. Today we're talking about Rock Lee. Why? Because he stands on business. And what if he started out with the Sasuke retrieval squad instead of coming late? How would he do against the Sound 4, and how would this actually impact the story and like how the arc progressed? Like and subscribe, or don't, is what it is. Can't really say anything about it. Let's get into the video. Now, the state of Lee in this discussion isn't simply going to be, oh, he's the same as he was in the Chunin exams. No. This is the Lee that's fresh out the hospital. He still got that little wrist wrap that, you know, they give you at the hospital that's like a little too difficult to take off. Y'all know what I'm talking about? It essentially means that Lee's not going to be performing at his optimal self. It kind of puts into perspective that maybe the fifth gate is outside his range. He kind of implies it when he's fighting Kimimaro. He's like, I just got out of surgery, so I can't go too crazy. But he does think he can open at least one of the inner gates. So we can maybe talk about a couple different scenarios there. But just due to how strong Lee fundamentally was in the Chunin exams and how the gates fundamentally operate as a multiplier, it does make it that I don't want to say he's immune to, but he's able to stay relevant throughout the entirety of part 1. At least when you compare him to the other Genin in the group. I'll talk about a lot of this stuff that becomes relevant in discussion. Now, I want to talk about the Sound 4 for a second, because we're going to start with Jirobo, obviously. A lot of people don't quite grasp how fatigued and weakened the Sound 4 were in their encounter with the Genin, as their bodies were immobile and they were forced to go into Curse Mark Stage 2 against Genma and Raido. The anime profiles also backs this up by just saying they're fatigued, but Jirobo, due to him actually absorbing chakra from the entirety of the group, could actually be argued to be the closest one to full power, or his full power self, and he's objectively weaker than the rest still. I will say, like, Lee is the first one to stop. Instead of Choji, he's the one that I'm like, alright, I'm gonna fight Jirobo. Jirobo's speed is somewhat questionable. We know with Doton he was able to trap the entirety of the Sasuke retrieval squad, but the group really wasn't expecting this, as Sakan and Ukon had put into like a play to separate and stop Shikamaru's shadow possession. So I don't know if I would say like this is the most objective speed feat, especially since Viewer style more so like formed around their feet with like starting at Jirobo. So it's a little tougher to say. We do see that when Jirobo attempts to chuck a giant boulder at the group, Choji is able to react and like form the human boulder, and it does like press Jirobo a little bit. So you could actually make a case that this version of Jirobo and Choji, even though like following the fact Jirobo does kind of handle Choji, may not be that far off in terms of speed, at least when talking about base Jirobo. Choji's also able to perceive him and like take the green pill and like catch him before Jirobo actually tackles him in the group. And I want to make a note about the 3 pills Choji takes. They're never explicitly noted to like boost his stats or anything. They're just noted to grant him explosive power and certain abilities. So like, how does base Lee stack up to green pill Jirobo? Well, it's kind of tough to say because we just don't know how fast Choji is like after all that training he's done in part 1. If you want to look at how base Sasuke can at least contend with the Sound 4, all 4, like jumping him at the same time, and how that Sasuke, at the very least, shouldn't be astronomically above the base Lee he was on the same level to in the Chunin exams, then that might put into perspective that this Choji's probably not on that level. I would also add, though, if you go off Kimimaro's assessment on how Lee might not be as easy as the likes of Naruto and Shikamaru, this same Kimimaro who just got done slamming around Kyuubi Naruto, this would also boost the arguments for Lee. Kimimaro say this too is pretty substantial because this is the same dude who was literally slapping away Shikamaru and Naruto before they could even really perceive him. He's just an animal. You could also maybe say Lee got stronger post-surgery somehow, although Gaara directly contradicts this. So we just should be careful about what we draw off of from the Kimimaro fight, because if you look at like the Lee that fights Kimimaro, before he sips his medicine, Kimimaro takes no offensive approach. He's literally just dodging Lee. There's not one panel where he actually throws an offensive strike. Lee also directly noting that he just can't land a single strike or kick on Kimimaro. So it's just like basically wasn't even performing that crazy against Kimimaro regardless. So, you know, while I think you could make a case he's relevant, we're not going to sit here and just say like he's above Kyuubi Naruto or anything like that. There's a lot to this. There's a lot to this to kind of like ascertain exactly where Lee is like in comparison, but I will say Choji just has not demonstrated like the feats of Lee even in this fight, so I wouldn't necessarily make the leap to say he's stronger and like Lee has more impressive showing / statements to him. So I'll go with the idea that Lee and Choji just really aren't that far off. We then run into a bunch of issues for base Lee versus Jirobo in the fact that Jirobo actually may be too durable for Lee to just blow through. Like, he's able to make Doton barriers like defensively and whatnot, so it's like it kind of depends on like the speed gap there. The reason base Lee isn't as relevant either in this situation is that he actually has to take his medicine very soon after he arrives, like, or is on the battlefield. So if you kind of go off that, Drunken Lee has to make an appearance. Now, Drunken Lee is obviously very unorthodox. It's going to be very hard to predict. This is the same guy that was kind of handling Kimimaro a bit due to the unorthodox nature of the Drunken Fist. I will also add that the Drunken Fist does seem to give Lee some sort of, like, stat boost. The anime actually adds the whole bit about Guy and Neji needing to restrain Lee, where Guy talks about, like, the Drunken Fist and how one gets stronger the more drinks they have and the more drunk the individual is. And Lee was able to perform the feat of having Guy and Neji restrain him after just getting one sip in. This also gets more crazy when you look at Neji's form in the flashback, and that he's in the way it's looking, he's gonna use like the 8 trigrams against Lee. So like, could you imply Drunken Lee might be above the likes of Neji? I don't know. Do what you want. But I will say it does seem like just drinking a whole bottle just gives him quote unquote invincible strength. So yeah, there's no way to quantify the amp that Drunken Fist gives. And this is definitely out there, but there is something we can use. I'll throw it in for the sake of the video. In Naruto Shippuden movie 1, Lee is fighting an individual he blatantly can't beat in the 5th gate and contemplates risking death to open the next gate. Lee contemplates this and like uses another trump card after remembering Guy, and it's an alcoholic treat given to him by Guy. And after using this, he completely dominates the person he was fighting, somewhat comparing a drunken amp to a gate level increase. Now, I'm not saying Lee gets 10 times stronger from sipping Patron, but I do think it is interesting to note that Lee does seem to be physically stronger, again, for some reason after getting a sip in. So it does seem to be on some level like an unorthodox plus stat boost. Kimimaro also notes like the speed increase as well. So that is something to consider here. And listen, if Kimimaro's not predicting this or also noting the speed, Jirobo's just absolutely getting handled. There's not really any discussion to be had in that case. It's actually so prevalent that it forces Kimimaro to use his first stage of the curse mark. So Drunken Lee just actually may overwhelm like base to curse mark stage 1 Jirobo, but the issue is, again, like once Jirobo goes stage 2, he actually might just be too durable for Lee to take down. And we see this as when Choji like expands into like the mountain-sized Choji, Jirobo's just holding him up with one fist. The speed of Choji's expansion is also very impressive. It's noted to be very fast. Some translations of the data book actually say it's like lightning speed. Take that as you will. I just think it is interesting to note. So you could make a case that, again, he might be able to just like before Lee like initiates the front lotus, Jirobo would undergo his version 2 transformation. Because Lee at this point arguably can't even use like the 5th gate. And again, right? It's a bit questionable, even if he did enter like more like beyond the 1st gate, if he would really be able to overcome that durability from Jirobo, as literally Choji goes to like 100 times multiplier to be able to one-shot him. And I know what people are also going to say and bring up, the fact that Jirobo and the curse mark is like a 10 times multiplier and the gates, you know, multiply Lee's strength by dozens of times, so it'll be better. I am super opposed to the idea that the curse mark stage 2 is just a straight up 10 times multiplier. It's never explicitly stated. It's just stated to increase the chakra supply 10 times, or like 10 times the power. So Jirobo states it increases his power 10 times. Sakon and Ukon like state, oh, my chakra is like 10 times greater. And obviously chakra control is what matters. Just having more chakra doesn't make you stronger. The only time this is really evident is when somebody undergoes like a 10 tails transformation and there's like an immediate speed amp. But no, this is like the whole reason like Bizu and Jinchuriki like exist and why one stated to be stronger than the other. And if you actually look at the Sound 4 data books, all of them list the version 2 as amping specific parts of each of the Sound Force arsenal. So for example, for Jirobo, since his transformation drastically increases his destructive power, any attack used in level 2 is strong enough to finish the foe. For Kidomaru, it's noted that in level 2, it gives him unmatched precision. For Sakon and Ukon, they gain the ability to use a specific technique that they can only use in version 2. With the power of their chakra, they're able to disassemble his body down to a cellular and even protonic level. This is also the same with Tuyuya's flute genjutsu that she can use in version 2. So it's just not like supported that it's just strictly 10 times. I'm also not saying they don't get faster, because everybody who uses the curse mark is noted to get a speed increase. I'm just saying like version 2 isn't a strict 10 times. It's also noted that with like the curse seals, the heaven and earth, they hold exceptional power, although their actual effects and potency are not directly evident. Anime Profiles also backs this up with stating that the curse marks just increase chakra and certain abilities from the Sound Force. So it's just pretty explicit that it's not just a straight up 10 times multiplier. So playing the multiplier game, it just doesn't really work in this discussion. So it's like, is Lee really gonna bust out something beyond Choji's like 100 times butterfly punch and just one-shot Jirobo? It doesn't seem likely. So you kind of have to argue that Lee uses the forward lotus or like the drunken fist and overwhelms Jirobo in his base or maybe curse mark stage 1 before he can get the chance to just like gain momentum via the higher stages of the curse mark. But the end all be all is that due to Lee's arsenal also damaging himself, as even the first gate does this, it's just going to be very hard for him to take on the durability of Jirobo. So Lee can win, although again, I don't think it's as likely as some people may make it out to be. Not necessarily due to a speed edge, but just due to the nature of Lee's arsenal and how in a similar position to Gaara, he may not just be able to like punch hard enough to beat Jirobo. Next up, we have Lee versus Kidomaru. Now, Kidomaru, even fatigued, is just straight out or flat out said to be stronger than Jirobo, even with the group's chakra that he absorbed. The chapter statement for Kidomaru against Neji also describes Kidomaru as the strongest enemy. Neji also states this, which would put him above the likes of Lee and the QB Naruto that Neji had fought in the Chunin exams. I also want to add too that the Neji that had been fighting Kidomaru not only had been training from the Chunin exams, but is implied to have been training after the fact. The anime blatantly supports this as he displays the 128 palms, which if you're familiar with like the whole Lee versus Neji debate, Neji's more comparable to like gated Lee, specifically the 3rd to 4th gate, as that whole like combo barrage was what was necessary, like the high speed taijutsu to take down Neji. Why is this relevant? Well, this is relevant due to how Kidomaru is extremely threatening to Neji with the speed of his web attacks. There are some minor encounters in the air where the whole group is present with Neji versus Kidomaru that aren't really worth discussing as there's a bit to them. However, we do see that in a strict 1v1 encounter, Kidomaru is actually able to overwhelm and catch Neji, even with Neji seeing the buildup of chakra and Kidomaru's attack and knowing an attack is coming. Lee has no way to break out of these webs. Kidomaru's like chakra webs that still have like chakra circulating through them that only Neji with like his gentle fist and ability to like shoot chakra out from all of his body to like break the webs. It's just not happening. Lee actually has no answer for this, which presents such issues if he's like able to get this kind of off on an opponent that superior or more comparable to like a heightened Lee in a weaker state, I might add. There is even the question that if Lee gets close enough to actually damage Kidomaru, there's Kidomaru's armor of sticky gold. Now, which is more so noted to be like better at negating ninjutsu. The databook notes that it's able to negate many like sort of ninjutsu similar to like Neji's gentle fist. However, it does have to have some defensive property for Kidomaru to be using it like a weapon and like throwing it at Neji and like the rest of the Sasuke retrieval squad. Kidomaru being a ranged fighter is very problematic for Lee in this situation. For Lee to really win, you'd have to argue Kidomaru's character of playing games allows Lee enough time to actually initiate the gates, but the minute Lee is actually caught in the webbing, the fight is more than likely finished, as Kidomaru generally attacks in tandem with his chakra webbing and use of sticky gold weapons. Kidomaru summoning a giant spider and subsequent rain of spiders more than likely doesn't make an appearance, as that strategy only came about due to Kidomaru being pinpointed by Neji, along with also wanting to stop rotation as Neji was just blocking his attacks with rotation or breaking free of webbing by emitting chakra. Lee also has no way to pinpoint Kidomaru's location. This fight just doesn't get to version 2 Kidomaru, it's sad to say, unless you argue that like Lee just straight up blitzes him off rip and then just like, which honestly I don't even think he's fast enough to do at this point, just since Kidomaru is also like, Neji's never moving too fast for Kidomaru to not react. Even when he's midair and Neji's like about to come from behind, he sees like Kiba's smirk and just like loosens the webs and Neji just misses. So it's like, you have to really think about if Neji is that much more comparable to like a higher stage of Lee, and like Kidomaru has no real issues with Neji unless Neji's like point blank close to him, there's no real chance for Lee. Even the front lotus doesn't even guarantee anything. I think this fight leans toward Kidomaru heavily, especially since Neji only got close after getting caught in the chakra webbing. So imagine Lee, who should be slower than that same Neji, at least in his base form. It's just not too questionable. So whereas Jirobo might be somewhat contentious, Kidomaru's a lot more objective to say like Lee wouldn't even really get the opportunity to just get the 5th gate off. You could also maybe make a case that he potentially gate amps after being caught in the webbing, and Kidomaru in like Kidomaru flat fashion of like playing games might let him. But again, even if he can't locate Kidomaru, what's he really gonna do? And even movements in the air rip Lee's muscle fibers, so it's just gonna be extremely difficult to argue that he actually does find Kidomaru and goes through all of these hoops when Neji, he had a tough fight against Kidomaru, like he was kind of getting countered, but he was also the perfect opponent for him, still took a 10 out of 10 difficulty fight. So it's really hard to imagine Lee like doing well in this situation. Next up we have Tayuya. Tayuya is probably the easiest fight Lee has out of all of the Sound 4. Essentially Tayuya just fights ranged with the Doki. Those are like the giant summons that she controls via her flute genjutsu and curse mark stage 1, I might add. And unlike before where like Kidomaru was like pressing this high skill like Hyuga user with all his perception capabilities, Shikamaru is just able to consistently dodge and outmaneuver out of the way of these Doki, which really just paints a picture that Lee would also more than likely be able to do the same. This also depends if you think Shikamaru is faster than base Lee. I don't think so. I don't really think there's any evidence to support that. It's not even as if Shikamaru has any scaling or any feats to necessarily paint him above base Lee as well. So I think Lee would be performing well in like maneuvering away from the Doki. And once he actually gets in close to Tayuya, this is one of those situations where activating the front lotus or just like beating her down with taijutsu is very effective and very likely in all situations. You might even see a situation where Lee just tries to box with the Doki themselves and just starts beating them up. So there's a lot he can do here. So there's obviously going to be some issues there. So out of all these scenarios, like there's always the chance that like, oh, how's Lee going to perform off rip? I think this is the strongest one where you can make a legitimate case. He literally just kicks her in the air and like front lotuses her. Drunk Lee would also be disastrous because it would be impossible for Tayuya to predict his movements and like maneuver the Doki with her flute into like a position where the questionably looking like white semi-substance chakra eating worm things that come out the Doki's mouth for Lee to get nerfed more and more throughout the fight as it goes on. So it's kind of an interesting one. Honestly, it really just kind of paints the idea that Lee has to perform this perfectly early fight. Otherwise, Tayuya can get a lot of momentum off on him. Lee could also just break down the trees in the forest, kind of similar to what he does in the Forest of Death, where he just grabs a tree root and rips it off the ground. So that would also disrupt the Doki's movement. So Lee definitely has a lot of options in this situation. There's also the question of Tayuya's flute genjutsu, which Lee really doesn't have a counter for, unless you could say maybe that while he's in the genjutsu, he initiates the gates, which would do a bit of self-harm to him, which would break him out, because Shikamaru breaks his own finger to break out of it. So there's definitely some possibility there. Like, what if Lee goes into the 4th to 5th gate, right? And he's like darting around everywhere, like too fast for her to perceive, and she uses the flute genjutsu. Like, him ripping his muscle fibers due to like the self-inflicting pain might unironically just make it so he wouldn't be caught in the genjutsu. Like, this is super hyper specific. I wouldn't make the case that him powering up into the gates would just break him out, but I do think like him ripping his muscle fibers does warrant enough question. Otherwise though, I do think the genjutsu would be pretty effective against him, unless you say like Lee bites his lip like Kurenai does against Itachi to break out of that genjutsu. I will say though, you could also make a case that, and this is like a lot of the games portray, and this is actually probably how Tayuya fights, and probably what she would have done had Shikamaru not just taken control of her Doki, in that she would more than likely use her flute genjutsu in conjunction with the Doki and like the chakra of physical energy eating worms, so that like once you're paralyzed you can't really dodge. So if she does see that Lee's like bullying them or just like preoccupied, she always can go into version state 2 and just initiate the genjutsu, which at that point is just going to be GG for Lee. There's not really too much you can really argue that he gets out of that, aside from maybe some of the stuff I brought up with like the pain. So I wouldn't say it's like object fact, but considering the fact that Tayuya only really went into like the flute genjutsu once Shikamaru took a hold of her Doki via Shadow Possession, I can't necessarily see the fight getting to that point. The fact that her flute is her only weapon too also just aids this. Like, it's literally her only option at this point. So if Lee just does well against the Doki and is like fast enough to just avoid them, he should be fine. So I would say Lee has a pretty good chance. Probably lean towards Lee in this situation. But with that being said, depending on how the battle goes, obviously Tayuya can get her flute genjutsu off and just take a W. But even then, I think that's very dependent on when she uses it, as opposed to, oh, her just using it and she wins the fight. Next up, we have Sakon and Ukon, and this one is brutal. Man, this is such a bad matchup for Lee. So the issue is that Sakon and Ukon's arsenal fundamentally makes it that physical blows don't really matter too much, since if either one takes damage, they can swap out with the other or just blatantly block attacks. This is why Sasuke's Lion's Barrage did nothing, right? Sasuke, who has arguably harder hitting moves than base Lee, considering how he was able to fatigue Gaara, Obviously a bit debatable, but at the very least, they should be comparable. So Lee's physical blows just aren't going to aid him in this situation in his base. I will also add that due to Ukon being able to move freely inside Sakon's body, it essentially makes it that Ukon can shoot his feet, arms, and face out of any part of Sakon's body and pretty much like add power to his moves. This is why when you see Sakon do like that barrage of fist, yeah, that's extra arms coming out of his arm. And for those who want to like wonder how crazy Sakon and Ukon are, they literally stopped a Fang over Fang. Like they just grabbed Kiba out of it. So it's like these guys are pretty insane in what they can do. So there's like a position like if Lee would even go for like the forward Lotus, they might just grab him or block it, which would be horrendous for Lee as there would be a ton of backlash. Like obviously Drunken Lee would do well in this situation. But again, right, the fact that a lot of his physical blows don't really offer him any momentum and like his only way to like really like hit Sakon or Ukon hard enough is to use like the gates is pretty disastrous for him. There's also the chance too that if he uses the gates on version 2 Sakon and Ukon, they actually might just separate and get back up, honestly. Or if he hits one body, the version that takes the damage could just swap out with the other one, which would be, again, disastrous for Lee. Or they could just decide to split off because they can do it manually. It does seem pretty likely, though, that like a higher gated Lee would definitely be faster than the likes of Sakon and Ukon. I will say, though, they are pretty fast themselves. The only reason they actually got tagged by Kiba's Wolf Fang over Fang was because there was drool on the floor that made them kind of slip and be uncoordinated, which led to them getting hit. So yeah, but that's even if the fight gets to that point. Like Drunken Lee could present some problems, but there's nothing to say it would like fundamentally go the route it did with Kimimaro. And in the minute Kimimaro like took him semi-seriously, the fight ended. Obviously, if Sakon or Ukon merge with Lee, that could be disastrous. An interesting scenario I could see is if one of them tries to merge and Lee actually like starts to initiate the gates and like starts bouncing around and causing his own body pain, like while attacking the other one in order to get the one that's merged with him to get back out because his muscles are going to be ripping. I don't know. I think that's kind of a cool and interesting scenario. I will say, though, we don't really have, like, good showings, you know, on, like, the durability aspect of what Sakon and Ukon can do. So I definitely wouldn't put it past, like, 5th Gate Lee to, like, put some damage on them and, like, actually take them down permanently. They also have access to the Rashomon gates, but there's no way to say that they would actually be able to just take down or react quick enough to 5th Gate Lee to actually be able to summon the gate. And the fact that this is Lee's main win condition with arguably, like, his Drunken Fist to base form not really opting for any, like, advantages here just kind of paints Sakon and Ukon as coming out a lot more confidently. Granted, Lee can do work. It's just that their arsenal is pretty good against Taijutsu users, and we've seen how they react to quite literally a variation of Lee's Taijutsu. So with a lot of these matchups, honestly, there is a lot of potential for Lee, but at the end of the day, it does have to be Lee at his absolute peak in the 4th to 5th gate, which I'm more so doing to be generous, like he more than likely can't do in his sickened state. And even then, it's like an all or nothing move. Because obviously after that point, he's not going to be able to move. And you have to argue that he's actually lasting enough in the fight to actually initiate the gates. Which at this point in the series, he wouldn't lead with them. Which is why in certain matchups, I feel he doesn't do as well. I think the Kimimaro fight best demonstrates what I'm talking about. He attempts to fight Kimimaro in base. And then he, you know, takes his medicine. And then only when all that fails, he tries to initiate the forward Lotus. And then Kimimaro absorbs the impact with his bones. Does this change too much? Well, it actually could have, in the sense that Drunken Lee kind of allowed Lee to stall Kimimaro and keep him at bay for a short period of time. After Sasuke emerged from the coffin, Kimimaro didn't really need to do anything except stall everybody else from going after Sasuke. So even then, like, it doesn't really make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. So it's kind of weird to say, but Lee really just didn't do too much during this arc. It was more so a question of, in my opinion, do you think the other members could stall as well as he did against Kimimaro? I think it is in some cases yes, in some cases no. But let me know what you guys think down below. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, all that new stuff. Bye-bye.